Everyone watching this video, everyone alive today, has grown up in a world where free markets and private enterprise are the cries of the conservative and the reactionary. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, if we zoom out a bit and take the bird's eye view, we can see that at some point not that long ago, these were progressive ideas that eroded traditional structures. In this sense, woke capital is nothing new. In fact, it's a return to historical normality. The only thing that's different now is the speed and violence with which capital destroys the social center. So we shouldn't be surprised that capital is woke. This is its natural state. But in this video, we're going to take apart the actual mechanisms that make capital a left-wing force. And I'm going to offer 4 different explanations for why capital is woke. Everyone and his dog has noticed by this point that big corporations love social justice, and they love it for the exact same reason they love regulations. It creates a barrier to entry. First, a note about barriers to entry. If you want to start a gardening business, you can do this with just a few $100s in capital. But if you want to start a bank, it's going to cost a lot more just to set up shop, and way more to be competitive. If the cost of doing business involves millions of dollars annually and lawyers, compliance officers, and specialized accountants before you even get a single customer, there's going to be a lot less competition. The barriers to entry are just too high. If you're a big player in a market, you want these barriers to entry to that market to be as high as possible, for obvious reasons. Well, workforce diversity is one such barrier to entry. In fact, it's one of the steepest and most permanent barriers. Let's explain why with an analogy. Suppose you own a baseball team, and for the sake of argument, let's say that your team is the most successful. You win 1 out of every 3 World Series or something. And then suppose the league passes a rule, in the interest of fairness, where 10% of the players that each team has to field in their starting lineup must be draft picks from the minor leagues. This rule would give an advantage to any team that could hoard all of the premier minor league talent. So if you're a Coca-Cola or an Apple or a Facebook, to mix metaphors a bit, you've got the resources to snap up basically the first 50 or 100 rounds of the draft. And this gives you a proportionally higher advantage than you normally get out of just having the most resources. This is because the IQ bell curve, and certainly the talent bell curve, if you could quantify that, is much narrower for the kind of people social justice is meant to help than for the kind of people it's meant to hurt. Just like for the minor leaguers, after the top first percentile, the talent pool starts to drop precipitously. So as a Nike or a Walmart, you want to leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to get that 10% of minor leaguers as high as possible. Maybe 20%, 30, 50%, or more if you can, because the higher the proportion, the more it advantages the one Walmart and disadvantages the 10,000 mom and pop shops. And wokeness is one of the steepest and most effective barriers for a couple of reasons. First, the huge conglomerates usually at least have to pay to create barriers, with lobbying and sometimes outright bribery. But social justice is now a kind of social convention, which means that social pressure is enough to make the rest go along willingly. So not only did Walmart not have to pay for this advantage, but legislation didn't create it and can't undo it. So this is the libertarian explanation. Where this explanation is weak is in explaining why woke capital is a new thing, because presumably this has always been the case. But that can be addressed by pointing out that capital has been a revolutionary force since the French Revolution at least. Still, this outwardly new tendency of capital to be woke is better accounted for by the second explanation. It's clear that capitalism, just like liberalism, has changed over time. Whereas the libertarian explanation doesn't account for how capitalism has changed, the managerial explanation does. Pioneered by James Burnham, the concept of the managerial class leans heavily on Robert Michel's iron law of oligarchy. In every association, however small, there's a tendency towards aristocracy. It's just the nature of organization that leaders will inevitably accrue unchecked power. And this is because human associations thrive on specialization of function, basically division of labor. And the functions within the highest degree of authority are always the most free from oversight. We call these leadership functions. This is the iron law of oligarchy. And the larger the organization, the more iron the law. Now, Michel's focused his analysis on political parties, vanguards, and other forms of specifically political organization. But Burnham applies the law to other forms of organization, including private companies. And it's through the iron law that what Burnham calls the managerial type, or managerial class, comes to dominate. And the managerial class dominates to such a degree that even shareholders and owners end up dancing to the managerial type's tune. For example, the founder of CrossFit, Greg Glassman, was removed from the company after correctly pointing out that quarantines and the Floyd riots had a common purpose. And Red Bull fired 2 top executives in 2020, not for being racist, but for not genuflecting to the ruling ideology hard enough. They were fired because the managerial elites within their organization circulated a petition to remove them because of their public silence on Black Lives Matter. But the iron law and Burnham's managerialism only explains why managers are in charge and not why they believe in social justice in the first place. This would be better explained by Sam Francis 2 generations later, and he did this by pointing out the intimate connection between the managerial class and liberal ideology. The managerial class is a kind of power, and as Bertrand de Jouvenel points out, the nature of power is to expand. Managerialism achieves this by creating problems that can only have managerial solutions. Better still is to create problems that aren't real and can, in principle, never be solved. Problems like white supremacy, unconscious bias, systemic racism, underrepresentation of women. These problems only ever involve expanding the scope and authority of managerial types. The manager, as a type, loves anything to do with radical environmentalism. This is natural because it gives him a purpose beyond just making the organization run efficiently. And this is the true logic of managerialism. Society, even the organization's customer base, must be molded and shaped into an acceptable form. This shaping must naturally be done by management, and here the logical conclusion of managerialism becomes clear. It's the same whether in the State Department, the military, or in Coca-Cola. These institutions, all of them, take on a didactic and evangelical character. Profit or military supremacy or good foreign policy becomes secondary. It's just the means by which the true end is accomplished, social change. This is the managerial explanation of Burnham and Francis, and it accounts for why capital has only now become woke. Managerialism had to expand to a sufficient point before the obsession with social justice could manifest. Only in its maturity could managerialism bear ideological fruit. But this explanation makes it seem like social justice is being imposed on an unwilling consumer. It leaves out that social justice is undoubtedly popular, at least among some of the population, if not all. But the mutually reinforcing dynamic between producer and consumer is taken into account much more fully by the third explanation. The managerial explanation of Burnham and Francis has the great virtue of explaining where woke ideology comes from more broadly. Woke capital is just a special case of this. But we should note 2 facts. 1, promoting social justice is not simply a cost. Woke capital is to some extent giving customers what they want. And 2, wokeness proliferated within corporate culture virally starting around the mid-2010s. And the technical explanation has the virtue of explaining these facts in a way the managerial explanation doesn't. In a nutshell, the technical explanation is that changes in technology account more than anything else for this sudden explosion within corporate culture of social justice ideology. And the best version of this explanation is given by Keith Woods in his video, What Created the Great Awakening, which will be linked in the description. And I won't rehearse the full argument here, not because it doesn't deserve it. It's actually one of the most interesting explanations, but you should absolutely watch Keith's video, so I'll just give you the basic overview and point you there. And the argument in its broadest outline is basically that Web 2.0 accelerated wokeness, and it did this by changing how media interacts with its audience. So in the early 2010s, pretty much all the biggest media companies moved to a paywall subscription model just to stay alive. And so now rather than revenue coming in from a broad audience, instead it's coming from a very online, committed fan base, and mass appeal is just there to attract paywall subs. And who's the most very online? Well, it's progressive activists, naturally. And so this change in income model drove the change in the New York Times user base. And this made it a lot more radical. And over a few years, every single media company adapted to become as hardcore as its new audience. The idea is that the woke ideology in the New York Times is essentially audience-driven, and these media are just responding to new incentives, driven ultimately by changes in technology. And now, this doesn't actually explain anything specifically about woke capital. Like Francis and Burnham, it's explaining how wokeness entered the culture more broadly. But this technological explanation generalizes to all media, including Google, Facebook, and so on. And where it touches on capital is this. All business, especially at the level of multinational corporations, depends crucially on the media and the internet in general. Companies spend billions of dollars annually on advertising, media outreach, search engine optimization, branding and messaging. And when the nature of the media changes, the nature of capital's relationship to it changes. At this point, if your brand isn't sufficiently committed to social justice, you're going to be relentlessly attacked in traditional print media, deplatformed from Facebook, and you're going to show up on the 16th Google search page. So it's of critical importance to at least pay lip service to the social justice ideology. And this tends to become less lip service and more committed belief over time for the reasons that Burnham and Francis outlined in the Managerial Explanation. The technical explanation is one of the most interesting, especially the restricted version that Keith Woods offers. He's not trying to explain where woke capital comes from, he's only explaining why it became hegemonic at this time and not some other time. But at the end of the day, any technical explanation is a trends and forces theory, what Marxists would recognize as a base superstructure model, where the ideological dimensions of social life depend largely on the material conditions. And while material conditions unquestionably play a role, if the adoption of the ruling ideology were driven primarily by bottom-up, audience-driven social forces, it would be a rarity, maybe even a historical first. A word for the other, top-down side of the coin will have to be reserved for the fourth explanation. Each of the explanations given so far have different virtues, but the absolutist explanation stands out as the most elegant and intuitive. Put simply, the explanation is that capital is woke because human will made it that way. What makes this explanation absolutist is that it traces back to Robert Filmer and Jean Baudin, whose top-down account of governance affirmed the primacy of human will in politics. And when you look at the recent history of capitalism, one event stands out as a turning point towards the Great Awakening. In 2006, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan convened a network of investors to develop the Principles for Responsible Investment, requiring companies to be evaluated in terms of criteria known as ESG. This stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. And it's as crucial to a company's existence as its stock price or its credit rating. In fact, Now both of these are determined in large part by a company's ESG score. The ESG rating system at its simplest is a social credit score for companies. And when properly understood, it explains not only why capital is woke, but much more than that, including why every major corporation marches in ideological lockstep on issues as diverse as climate change, board representation of women, and the latest global conflict. So what is ESG? A company's ESG rating is a measurement of its commitment to environmental, social, and governance initiatives. It's a kind of credit rating that measures a company's conformity to the prevailing liberal orthodoxy. The ESG score of a company now takes into account 22 metrics, and on the basis of these assigns a social credit score of 3 categories: leader, average, and laggard, along with a rating, from AAA leader all the way down to CCC laggard. The progressive language of leaders and laggards is not accidental. These 22 metrics were taken directly from a document drafted by the World Economic Forum and the International Business Council called Davos Manifesto 2020, the universal purpose of a company in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. These metrics include things like land use and water consumption, but also things like membership of underrepresented social groups, gender pay equality, and contribution to NGOs. This ESG rating system is still in the process of creation, and these 22 metrics have been designed to align with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has been widely publicized and widely criticized outside of progressive circles, but it can be traced back to the UN's 2006 Principles for Responsible Investment Convention. This effectively committed the world's largest institutional investors to make the use of ESG scores a cornerstone of investment practice. And more than that, it committed them to enshrining it into law, a process that's actively underway today. Since then, the value of ESG assets has risen from $6.5 trillion and is projected to reach $140 trillion by 2025. Now, in a sense, woke capital is nothing new. Investor activism began in the 1960s as a socially responsible investing, where investment firms would exclude certain stocks or even whole industries, even though they were profitable, because they didn't align with their progressive ideology. By the 1980s, this was called corporate social responsibility and had reached the mainstream. College endowments and then pension funds led a movement to divest from their portfolios those companies with operations in apartheid South Africa. 1990 was a benchmark year for investor activism because it marks the launch of the first socially responsible index by MSCI, now one of the premier ESG indexes. Since then, woke capital has become highly strategic and has formalized itself into a number of strategies. Impact investing, investing not to profit, but to ensure change. Active ownership, exercising ownership rights and making outright threats to ensure change. Thematic investing, investing on the basis of structural shifts already underway. Think of the demographic replacement in the West and how many billions of dollars of capital have been invested on the assumption that this replacement will take place. And you can understand the structural factors tying corporate firms to making sure this replacement happens. So woke capital is nothing new. What is new is the formal commitment to it that kicked it into high gear in 2006. And this commitment was to make sure that all investment was done according to ESG scores. But what does an ESG score actually measure? At its most basic, an ESG score is a measure of risk. But what exactly is the risk involved with avoiding diversity hiring? Surely it's not a risk of losing out on talent, because as the Libertarian Explanation noted, the talent pool is proportionally narrower for diversity hires. But there is a financial risk, and this is why investors care about it. Quite a bit of empirical research does support a link between corporate social justice and financial performance. But to assume that woke HR policies drive higher profits is to put the cart before the horse. What's driving both of them is regulatory pressure and the threat of outright state intervention in industries that are insufficiently progressive. The financial risk that ESG measures is a risk that flows from the top down. For example, there's an empirical link between a company's ESG score and a reduced compliance burden placed on it. And similar studies show a negative correlation between ESG score and regulatory fines. Although ESG scores aren't formally regulated in the US, the lower house recently passed legislation requiring companies to publish quarterly ESG metrics. So the push in 2006 for the world's biggest investors to enshrine ESG into law is now starting to bear fruit. This continues to this day, with the Securities Exchange Commission considering regulating the rules for disclosing climate risk, board diversity, and other woke issues. So the involvement of the state in fostering woke capital is clear, and investors have simply been following their nose, anticipating that the state will continue to micromanage corporate culture by legal fiat. This is why ESG-compliant companies get better access to sticky pools of capital. Being woke does nothing to help you deliver a product or a service, but it does ward off the eye of Sauron. So the Absolutist explanation is quite simple and is supported by the actions of institutional investors themselves. Capital is woke because it responds to investors respond to risk, and risk is generated by governments, first implicitly and now explicitly, to enforce social engineering. This is more of the Juvenilian mechanism where central power must capture intermediary structures and deputize them to carry out work that it can't do itself. So we've outlined 4 different reasons why capital is woke. But the ultimate answer for why capital is woke is all of the above. All of these explanations are right. Some emphasize human will, others structural and material factors, but all of them play a role. Wokeness is simply good for the biggest players. It grows out of managerial culture. Recent changes in technology have kicked it into overdrive, and ultimately, capital is woke because central power makes it so. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.